Sometimes the greatest prisons are the ones we build for our own hearts. After 800 years of loneliness, Lord Davis had forgotten what it meant to hope for anything beyond duty and survival. The ancient vampire lord stood at the altar, preparing to marry a stranger in a political alliance between vampire and human kingdoms. He expected to spend eternity with a frightened young bride who would never understand the weight of his past. But when she lifted her veil, he saw something impossible. Eyes that held centuries of their own pain and wisdom. Lady Aveline was not the trembling maiden he'd been promised. What had both kingdoms been hiding about his bride? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ancient stones of Ravenmoor Castle had witnessed 8 centuries of bloodshed, and Lord Davis could feel their weight pressing down upon him as he stood in his private chambers, staring out at the fog-shrouded lands that stretched endlessly toward the human kingdoms. The obsidian throne behind him, carved from volcanic glass in the early days of his reign and embedded with fragments of souls from enemies long forgotten, cast strange shadows in the candlelight. It had been his seat of power for so long that he sometimes wondered if he had become part of it, as cold and unyielding as the black stone itself. The castle's corridors echoed with preparation for tomorrow's ceremony. Servants hurried past his door, carrying linens and silver, their footsteps muffled by centuries-old tapestries that depicted battles he had fought when the world was younger and his heart less hardened. Through the thick walls he could hear the distant sounds of kitchens working through the night, preparing feast enough for both vampire and human dignitaries, a delicate balance of foods that would satisfy both mortal appetites and the more particular needs of his immortal guests. Matthias knocked and entered without waiting for permission, as was his privilege after 500 years of faithful service. The vampire advisor's face bore the same expression it had worn for weeks, concern mixed with careful neutrality. He had been Davis's most trusted confidant since the dark years following the Great Purge, when vampire clans had nearly destroyed themselves in civil war, and his counsel had never been more needed than now. "The human delegation has retired for the evening," Matthias reported, settling into the chair Davis kept specifically for these late-night conversations. "Their ambassador seems nervous about tomorrow's ceremony. He keeps asking questions about our customs, particularly regarding the veil tradition." Davis turned from the window, his pale features catching the flickering light. At 800 years old, he appeared to be a man in his prime, but his dark eyes held depths of experience that spoke of centuries spent making impossible choices. His black hair, once worn long in the fashion of medieval lords, was now cropped shorter, a concession to modern times that he'd made reluctantly. What manner of questions? Whether it's customary for the bride to remain veiled until the final moment of the ceremony, whether there are consequences if she chooses not to remove it. Matthias paused, choosing his words carefully. "I get the impression they're as uncertain about this match as we are." The marriage had been negotiated over months of careful diplomacy, a desperate attempt to forge lasting peace between the vampire clans and the human kingdoms that bordered their territories. For too long, skirmishes had erupted along the borderlands, fueled by fear and misunderstanding on both sides. The human king had offered his ward, a young noblewoman from a minor house, in exchange for territorial concessions and trade agreements that would benefit both realms. Davis had accepted because he understood the mathematics of survival. His people needed stability more than they needed his personal happiness. At 800 years old, he had long ago abandoned any hope of finding genuine companionship. The few relationships he'd attempted over the centuries had ended badly, Mortal women aging and dying while he remained unchanged, or immortal ones ultimately revealing ambitions that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with power. "Tell me about her family again," Davis said, settling into his own chair beside the massive fireplace. The flames cast dancing shadows across his features, highlighting the sharp angles that had made more than one opponent underestimate his capacity for mercy. Matthias consulted the documents he carried everywhere these days. Lady Averlane of House Blackthorn, minor nobility from the eastern provinces. Her parents died when she was young, a plague that swept through their lands some 20 years ago. She was raised in the royal court as a ward of the crown, educated alongside the princess. Reports suggest she's intelligent, well-read, and has spent considerable time in the royal library studying diplomatic history. Diplomatic history. Davis allowed himself a small, bitter smile. A polite way of saying she's been studying our weaknesses? Perhaps. Or perhaps she genuinely wishes to understand the people she'll be living among. Matthias set down the papers and regarded his lord with the frank affection of an old friend. "You know, Davis, it's possible this arrangement could work in ways we haven't considered. A genuinely intelligent bride might prove to be an asset rather than a burden." Davis had heard such optimism from his advisor before, usually when political circumstances forced them into situations that seemed impossible to navigate. Matthias had a gift for finding silver threads in the darkest tapestries, a quality that had served them well during the worst of their conflicts. But this felt different. This felt personal in ways that made Davis deeply uncomfortable. "Intelligence in a bride is often more dangerous than ignorance," Davis replied. "Intelligent people ask questions, they form opinions, they make demands." He stood and walked to a cabinet that held maps of the borderlands, spreading one across a nearby table. "What I need is compliance, not curiosity." The map showed the delicate balance they'd achieved through careful negotiation. Human settlements clustered along the southern borders, protected by ancient agreements that forbade vampire hunting parties from venturing into mortal lands. In exchange, the human kingdoms acknowledged vampire sovereignty over the northern territories and agreed not to support the vampire hunters who still operated in secret, seeking to eliminate what they considered an unholy threat to mortal souls. It was an uneasy peace, maintained through constant vigilance and occasional shows of force when either side pushed too hard against the established boundaries. The marriage alliance was meant to strengthen those bonds, creating a personal connection between the ruling houses that would make future conflicts less likely. "The ceremony tomorrow will be watched by representatives from every major house on both sides," Matthias continued. "If this works, if the alliance holds, it could mean genuine stability for the first time in centuries. No more border raids, no more midnight evacuations when hunter parties ventured too far north." Davis traced the border lines with one finger, remembering the battles fought over each mile of contested territory. He had negotiated this peace through a combination of strategic withdrawal and overwhelming displays of power when withdrawal wasn't enough. The humans respected strength, they always had. But they also feared it, and fear made people unpredictable. "And if it doesn't work?" Davis asked quietly. "If the girl proves unsuitable, or if the human nobles decide they've made a mistake in trusting us?" "Then we fall back on the same strategies we've always used." "But Davis..." Matthias stood and joined him at the map table. "You haven't allowed yourself to hope for anything beyond survival for so long that you've forgotten what peace might actually look like. This could be a chance for something better than constant vigilance." The words stung because they carried truth. Davis could barely remember the young vampire he'd been before the Great Purge. before centuries of warfare had taught him that emotional attachments were liabilities that enemies could exploit. He'd built walls around his heart that were stronger than the stone walls of Ravenmoor Castle, and he wasn't certain they could be torn down even if he wanted them to be. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Helena, the castle's head steward, entered carrying a silver tray with documents requiring his immediate attention. She had served Ravenmoor for over 300 years, hired when she was a young vampire fleeing persecution in the Southern Territories. Now she managed the castle's daily operations with an efficiency that allowed Davis to focus on larger strategic concerns. "My lord," she said, with the respectful familiarity of long service, "the final arrangements for tomorrow's feast. The cook needs to know whether to prepare the traditional blood wine or if you prefer something less distinctive for our human guests." The question highlighted one of the many small complications of hosting both species. Vampire dietary requirements weren't exactly secret, but there was a difference between acknowledging them intellectually and watching them served at a formal dinner. "Prepare both," Davis decided. "Let our guests choose what they're comfortable with." Helena nodded and made notes on her papers. "And the bride's chambers. She'll be arriving at dawn. We've prepared the rose suite as requested. But should we make any special accommodations?" "What sort of accommodations?" Davis felt a flicker of curiosity despite himself. The human ambassador mentioned that Lady Aveline has particular requirements regarding her personal effects. Apparently she travels with a rather extensive collection of books and other items. They were quite specific about ensuring her belongings remained undisturbed. "Other items?" Davis exchanged a glance with Matthias. In his experience, when diplomats became deliberately vague about details, those details usually mattered more than they wanted to admit. "See that her belongings are handled exactly as she requests," Davis instructed. "And Helena, assign someone reliable to attend her. Someone who can answer questions without revealing anything we'd prefer to keep private." After Helena departed, silence settled over the chamber like a familiar weight. Davis had spent countless nights like this one, reviewing plans and preparing for events that would determine the fate of his people. But tomorrow felt different. Tomorrow he would bind himself to a stranger, and regardless of political necessity, the binding would be real and permanent, according to both vampire law and human custom. "Are you ready for this?" Matthias asked quietly. Davis considered the question seriously. He was ready for the politics, ready for the negotiations, and careful balance of personalities that would follow. He was prepared to be courteous to a young woman who had probably been as unwilling a participant in these arrangements as he was. But was he ready for the possibility that this marriage might become something more than a diplomatic formality? "I'm ready to do what's necessary," he said finally. "I've been preparing for necessary choices my entire existence." "That's not what I asked." Davis returned to the window, looking out over lands he'd protected for so long that he could no longer imagine any other purpose for his existence. Somewhere out there, in guest chambers he'd never visited, a young woman was probably lying awake, wondering what her life would become after tomorrow. He felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for her situation, thrust into an arrangement she likely had no power to refuse, expected to make the best of circumstances that would isolate her from everything familiar. "No," he admitted quietly. "I'm not ready to hope for anything beyond what duty requires. Hope has been a luxury I couldn't afford for too long to remember how to indulge in it now." Matthias gathered his papers and moved toward the door, but paused at the threshold. Sometimes the most necessary choice is the one that teaches us to hope again. After his advisor departed, Davis remained at the window until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Tomorrow would bring changes he couldn't predict or control, and for perhaps the first time in centuries, that uncertainty didn't fill him with the cold satisfaction of a challenge to be mastered. Instead, he felt something that might have been anticipation, mixed with a fear he wasn't quite ready to name. The obsidian throne behind him reflected the growing light, its dark surface catching fire from the sunrise. Soon he would no longer face the dawn alone. Whether that would prove to be salvation or simply another form of solitude remained to be seen. The cathedral bells of Ravenmoor had not rung for a wedding in over 2 centuries, but their bronze voices filled the morning air with music that seemed to awaken the very stones of the ancient fortress. Davis stood before the altar in his formal ceremonial attire, black velvet doublet embroidered with silver thread, a cloak that had belonged to his father, and at his throat the heavy silver chain that marked him as Lord of the Northern Territories. The weight of tradition pressed down upon his shoulders almost as heavily as the expectations of the assembled guests. Representatives from every major vampire house filled the left side of the cathedral, their pale faces turned toward the altar with expressions ranging from cautious optimism to barely concealed skepticism. On the right, human dignitaries sat in careful formal arrangement, their colorful court dress a sharp contrast to the monochromatic preferences of vampire fashion. Between the two groups lay an invisible line of tension that 8 months of careful negotiation had only partially bridged. Archbishop Cornelius, ancient even by vampire standards, stood ready to perform a ceremony that blended human and vampire traditions in ways that satisfied both customs without offending either. His ceremonial robes, heavy with gold thread and precious stones, caught the light streaming through stained glass windows that depicted scenes from the early days of vampire-human cooperation, a time so distant that most present could barely remember when such cooperation had been common rather than extraordinary. The great doors opened with a sound that echoed through the vaulted space, and Lady Avelin's procession began. Davis kept his expression carefully neutral as he watched her approach, flanked by human guards and preceded by young women scattering flower petals in the traditional manner. She moved with a grace that spoke of excellent breeding and careful training, her heavy silk gown trailing behind her in waves of midnight blue that seemed almost black in the cathedral's shadowed light. But it was the veil that commanded attention. The crimson fabric fell from a jeweled circlet to pool around her shoulders, completely obscuring her face and form. According to the briefings Davis had received, the veil was a family heirloom, passed down through generations of Blackthorn women and worn only on the most significant occasions. The deep red color was unusual for a wedding, but human customs often seemed arbitrary to vampire sensibilities. As Aveline reached the altar, Davis caught a glimpse of her hands beneath the flowing sleeves of her gown. They were elegant, long-fingered, and steady, not the trembling appendages he might have expected from a young woman facing such a momentous occasion. When she spoke her responses to the Archbishop's opening questions, her voice carried clearly through the cathedral, betraying no nervousness or uncertainty. The ceremony proceeded according to the carefully rehearsed script. Davis spoke his vows with the same measured precision he brought to treaty negotiations, promising protection, respect, and loyalty in terms that satisfied legal requirements without venturing into emotional territory. When Aveline spoke hers, he listened for inflections that might reveal something about the woman beneath the veil, but her tone remained perfectly modulated, giving nothing away. Then came the moment he had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Archbishop Cornelius raised his hands and spoke the words that would seal their union. Let the bride reveal herself to her husband and to these witnesses, that all may know the bond has been freely given." Avelaine's hands moved to the edges of her veil, and Davis found himself holding his breath despite having no need for such mortal reflexes. He expected to see a young face, probably pretty in the conventional manner of noble breeding, marked by the kind of innocence that would make their vast difference in age and experience an uncomfortable reminder of his own immortal nature. Instead, when the crimson fabric fell away, Davis felt the world shift beneath his feet in a way he hadn't experienced since his first death 8 centuries ago. The woman standing before him was no innocent maiden. Silver hair caught the cathedral light like spun moonlight, framing a face that bore the subtle lines of someone who had lived long enough to accumulate genuine wisdom. Her skin had the pale translucency that came from magical practice rather than simple nobility, and her eyes, those were what truly stopped his breath. They were the deep blue-green of ocean depths, ancient and knowing, holding secrets that spoke of decades or perhaps centuries of hidden experience. But it was more than her appearance that shattered his expectations. When their eyes met, Davis felt a jolt of recognition that went beyond the physical, a sense that he was looking at someone who understood the weight of immortal existence in ways that no mere mortal could. The careful composure he had maintained throughout the ceremony cracked slightly as he struggled to process what he was seeing. "Lady Aveline," he managed, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Lord Davis." Her response was calm, measured, and carried undertones of amusement that suggested she had anticipated his shock. "I hope I meet with your approval." The words were formally appropriate, but there was something in her tone, a subtle challenge, perhaps, or simple acknowledgement that they both knew. This moment changed everything about their carefully negotiated arrangement. She wasn't the frightened young bride either kingdom had led him to expect. This was a woman who had clearly lived long enough to develop her own power and perspective. Archbishop Cornelius cleared his throat gently, reminding them that the ceremony still required completion. Davis forced himself to focus on the remaining rituals, but his mind raced with questions that had nothing to do with formal procedure. How old was she, really? What had both kingdoms been concealing about her background? And why did looking at her feel like recognizing something he had been searching for without realizing it? The exchange of rings proceeded without incident, though Davis noticed that Aveline's hands remained completely steady, while his own betrayed the slightest tremor. When they joined hands for the final blessing, he felt a warmth that seemed to spread from her touch, up his arm, and toward his chest, a sensation he couldn't remember experiencing since his mortal years. "By the ancient laws of both our peoples, and in the sight of these witnesses, I declare you bound in marriage," Archbishop Cornelius announced. "Let this union bring peace to both realms and joy to both hearts." The assembled guests rose to their feet, applause filling the cathedral as rice and flower petals showered down upon the newly married couple. Davis performed his expected role, offering Aveline his arm and escorting her down the aisle, while nodding acknowledgement to various dignitaries. But his attention remained fixed on the woman beside him, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he thought he knew about their arrangement. As they reached the cathedral doors, Aveline leaned slightly toward him and spoke quietly enough that only vampire hearing could pick up her words. "I imagine you have questions, my lord. Perhaps we might find time for private conversation before the evening's festivities begin." The suggestion was perfectly reasonable and entirely proper, but something in her tone suggested that the conversation she had in mind would venture far beyond polite, getting-to-know-you pleasantries. Davis found himself looking forward to it with an anticipation that had nothing to do with political necessity, and everything to do with genuine curiosity about the woman he had just married. "Indeed," he replied, matching her quiet tone. "I find myself eager to learn more about my bride." As they stepped into the afternoon sunlight, Davis caught sight of a commotion near the castle's main entrance. A ornate hand mirror, part of Avelin's personal belongings being carried inside, had somehow fallen from a servant's grip. The ancient glass had shattered completely, leaving jagged fragments scattered across the stone courtyard that caught the light like broken stars. "How unfortunate," Aveline murmured. But Davis noticed she didn't seem particularly distressed by the destruction of what was clearly a valuable piece. If anything, there was something almost satisfied in her expression as she regarded the broken mirror. The mirror of souls, he realized with a start. Legend held that certain enchanted mirrors could reveal the true nature of supernatural beings, but only if they remained intact. The fact that this particular mirror had shattered upon being brought into proximity with Avelin raised questions that made his centuries-old instincts for danger tingle with warning. What exactly had both kingdoms conspired to bring into his home? The first 3 days of married life passed in a careful dance of polite formality that satisfied the watching eyes of both delegations, while revealing almost nothing about the woman Davis had wed. Aveline moved through the castle with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to navigating complex political situations, acknowledging servants with kindness, responding to formal introductions with appropriate grace, and giving every appearance of a well-bred noblewoman adapting to her new circumstances. But Davis noticed details that troubled his carefully maintained equilibrium. She never seemed lost or confused by the castle's labyrinthine corridors, despite claiming this was her first visit to vampire territory. When Helena showed her to the library, a vast collection spanning centuries of accumulated knowledge, Aveline's eyes lingered on texts written in languages that predated most human scholarship, and there were moments when she thought herself unobserved, where her expression held depths of experience that no 20-year-old should possess. On the 4th morning, Davis decided direct observation might yield more information than reports from his staff. He found Avelin in the castle's eastern tower, standing before a window that overlooked the training yards where young vampires practiced combat forms that had been refined over generations of warfare. She wore a simple morning dress of deep green wool, her silver hair caught back in a style that emphasized the elegant line of her neck and the quiet intelligence in her profile. "The architecture here is remarkable," she said, without turning, apparently having sensed his approach despite his deliberate stealth. "These stones have witnessed considerable history." Davis moved to stand beside her at the window. 800 years of it. My father built this tower after the Great Purge, when defensive positions became more important than impressive facades. He paused, studying her reaction. Most humans find vampire history rather unsettling. History is rarely comfortable, regardless of which species writes it. Avelin's tone remained conversational, but there was something in her words that suggested personal familiarity with uncomfortable truths. Your people survived a civil war that nearly destroyed everything your ancestors built. That requires a particular kind of strength. The comment demonstrated knowledge that went beyond what any diplomatic briefing would have contained. Davis had been careful to ensure that human accounts of the Great Purge focused on political necessity rather than the brutal details of vampire-on-vampire warfare. Yet Aveline spoke as if she understood not just the facts, but the emotional weight of those years. "You seem unusually well informed about events that occurred before your birth," Davis observed carefully. I've always found history fascinating. The Royal Library contained extensive records of diplomatic relations between our peoples. Aveline finally turned to face him, and Davis felt that same unsettling jolt of recognition he'd experienced at the altar. Understanding the past seemed important if I was to have any hope of contributing meaningfully to the future. It was a reasonable answer that explained nothing while seeming to explain everything. Davis found himself studying her face, looking for tells that might reveal whether she was being deliberately evasive or simply possessed of natural diplomatic instincts. Her expression remained serene, giving away nothing beyond intelligent attention to their conversation. "Matthias mentioned you've requested access to our archives," Davis said. "That's an unusual interest for a new bride." "Is it?" Aveline moved away from the window, her hands trailing along the stone wall as if she were reading something in the ancient masonry. "I would think understanding the legal frameworks that govern our marriage would be essential. The Chronicle of Binding Oaths makes for particularly interesting reading." Davis felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The Chronicle of Binding Oaths was not a document he had expected her to know about, much less request permission to examine. It contained the actual terms of their marriage contract, including provisions that had been negotiated in secret between the Vampire Council and human diplomats, clauses that dealt with magical protections, territorial boundaries, and ancient laws that predated both current governments. "That's a rather technical document," he said slowly. "Most of it concerns legal precedents that would be meaningless to someone without extensive background in supernatural law." "Perhaps, but I prefer to understand exactly what I've committed myself to." Aveline's smile was perfectly pleasant and entirely uninformative. "I hope that doesn't concern you." Before Davis could respond, a commotion in the courtyard below drew their attention. Helena was directing a group of servants in moving what appeared to be an unusually heavy trunk, her normally calm demeanor showing signs of strain. Even from their elevated position, Davis could see that the trunk required 4 vampires to lift safely, far more than any normal collection of personal belongings should require. "Your possessions seem to require considerable care in handling," Davis observed. "I travel with a few items that have sentimental value. Old books, family heirlooms, that sort of thing." Aveline's tone remained casual, but Davis noticed her hands had moved to rest against the window frame in a way that suggested tension. "I hope the additional effort doesn't inconvenience your staff." "Not at all. Though I confess curiosity about what might require such robust handling. Perhaps I could show you sometime, when we've had more opportunity to become properly acquainted." The suggestion was made with perfect propriety, but there was something in Aveline's voice that hinted at layers of meaning beneath the simple words. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Matthias, who climbed the tower stairs with the purposeful stride that usually indicated urgent business. His expression, when he reached them, carried the careful neutrality he employed when delivering information he suspected would not be well received. "My lord, Lady Aveline, forgive the interruption, but we've received word from the border stations. There's been an incident near Thornwood. Nothing serious, but it requires your immediate attention." Davis felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling over his shoulders. Border incidents were rarely as minor as initial reports suggested, and Thornwood lay in one of the most sensitive areas along the human-vampire frontier. "What manner of incident?" "A hunting party from the human settlements crossed into our territory in pursuit of wounded game. They encountered one of our patrols and words were exchanged. No violence, but considerable tension. The patrol leader is requesting guidance on how to proceed." It was exactly the sort of situation their marriage alliance was supposed to prevent, the kind of casual boundary crossing that could escalate into serious conflict if not handled with careful diplomacy. Davis glanced at Aveline, wondering how she would react to this immediate reminder of the fragile nature of the peace they were meant to represent. "I'll need to review the patrol reports and draft a response that satisfies both sides without setting dangerous precedents," Davis said. "Matthias, have the relevant documents prepared for—" "Perhaps I could assist," Aveline interrupted quietly. "If this concerns the interpretation of boundary agreements, I might offer perspective on how human leaders are likely to view the situation." Both vampires stared at her. It was an extraordinary offer. New brides were not typically expected to involve themselves in political crises, especially ones that might require delicate negotiations between hostile parties. Yet something in her tone suggested this was not an impulsive suggestion, but a carefully considered offer of genuine expertise. "That's very thoughtful," Davis said carefully. "But these situations require familiarity with precedents and protocols that I couldn't possibly understand," Aveline finished with a slight smile. "Of course. Perhaps you're right. Though I confess disappointment at discovering my education has been so inadequate." The gentle rebuke was delivered without heat, but it carried enough steel to make Davis reconsider his automatic dismissal. If she truly possessed insight into human political thinking, her perspective might indeed prove valuable. And if she was merely attempting to insert herself into affairs beyond her understanding, observing her efforts would reveal important information about her character and intentions. "Very well," he decided. "If you're genuinely interested in contributing to a solution, your perspective would be welcome." Aveline's smile brightened with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "Excellent. Shall we begin with reviewing exactly what agreements govern that particular stretch of territory?" As they descended the tower stairs toward his study, Davis found himself wondering once again what both kingdoms had conspired to bring into his life. Nothing about his bride fitted the pattern of a political pawn being moved across the board by more powerful players. Instead, she seemed to be maneuvering herself into position with the confidence of someone who understood the game far better than anyone had let him believe. Whether that would prove to be an asset or a danger remained to be seen. The border crisis at Thornwood proved to be an illuminating introduction to Aveline's capabilities. Davis had expected to spend hours explaining the complex web of territorial agreements and historical precedents that governed vampire-human interactions. Instead, he discovered his bride possessed an understanding of diplomatic protocols that rivaled his own centuries of experience. The Thornwood Accords of 1847 specifically address hunting party incursions, Aveline observed, her finger tracing lines of text in the leather-bound treaty collection with familiarity that spoke of prior study. Article 7 allows for pursuit of wounded game across territorial boundaries, but only if certain notification procedures are followed. Did the human hunters provide advance notice to your patrols? Davis found himself impressed despite his reservations. No, which gives us grounds to treat this as a boundary violation rather than a legitimate pursuit. He paused, studying her profile as she continued reading. You're remarkably well versed in agreements that most human nobles consider tediously technical. I've always believed that understanding the rules makes it easier to work within them, or around them, when circumstances require. Aveline looked up from the documents with a slight smile. Shall I draft a response that acknowledges their explanation while reinforcing our territorial sovereignty? The suggestion was both practical and politically astute. A response written by the human bride herself would carry weight with human authorities While demonstrating vampire willingness to work through proper diplomatic channels, Davis found himself nodding agreement before he'd fully considered the implications of allowing her such immediate involvement in sensitive negotiations. Their collaboration over the next 2 days revealed depths to Aveline's knowledge that raised increasingly urgent questions about her background. She demonstrated familiarity with legal precedents dating back centuries, referenced territorial disputes that had been resolved before her supposed birth, and displayed an intuitive understanding of vampire political psychology that should have required decades of exposure to develop. It was during one of these working sessions that Davis witnessed the first clear evidence that his bride was not entirely what she appeared to be. A castle servant, young Marcus, recently turned and still struggling with the enhanced strength that came with vampiric transformation, had been carrying documents to Davis's study when he stumbled on an uneven stone. The heavy wooden box containing treaty originals tumbled from his arms, and Marcus fell hard against the sharp edge of a stone pillar. Blood flowed freely from a gash across his forehead that would have been merely inconvenient for an experienced vampire, but seemed to overwhelm the young man's newly awakened healing abilities. Aveline was on her feet and moving before Davis had fully processed what had happened. She knelt beside Marcus with fluid grace, her hands going immediately to the wound with the confidence of someone accustomed to dealing with medical emergencies. "Hold still," she murmured, her voice taking on a tone Davis hadn't heard before. Gentle but absolutely authoritative. "Let me help." What happened next challenged everything Davis thought he knew about human limitations. Aveline's hands began to emit a soft, warm light that seemed to emanate from her skin itself. The moonstone pendant at her throat pulsed in rhythm with the glow, casting subtle silver reflections across the stone walls. As she held her hands over Marcus's wound, the bleeding slowed, then stopped entirely. The gash began to close with a speed that rivaled vampire healing capabilities. "There," Aveline said quietly, helping Marcus to his feet with steady hands. "You'll want to be more careful on these old stones. They're treacherous when you're not paying attention." Marcus stared at her with the wide-eyed wonder of someone who had just witnessed something impossible. "My lady, How did you—" "Clean up these documents, please," Aveline interrupted, gently but firmly. "Lord Davis and I have work to complete." After Marcus departed, moving with considerably more care, silence filled the study. Davis found himself staring at his bride with a mixture of fascination and growing wariness. The display of healing power had been undeniably real, but it raised questions that struck at the heart of everything he'd been told about their marriage arrangement. "That was impressive," he said carefully, though not precisely what I'd expect from a minor noble raised in human courts. Aveline resumed her seat at the document table with perfect composure, though Davis noticed her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her wine goblet. "I've always had a gift for healing. My guardian believed it came from my mother's side. There were stories of women in our family line who possessed unusual abilities." "Unusual abilities." Davis moved to pour himself wine, using the action to mask his careful study of her expression. "That's one way to describe magic, that rivals anything our own healers can accomplish." "Is it magic?" Aveline's tone remained conversational, but there was steel beneath the casual words. "Or simply a talent that manifests differently than expected. Humans have been known to possess gifts that don't fit neatly into conventional categories." It was a deflection that acknowledged his observation while revealing nothing concrete about her abilities or their source. Davis found himself simultaneously frustrated by her evasiveness and impressed by her skill at diplomatic non-answers. Whoever had trained her in such techniques had done exceptional work. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock on the study door. Matthias entered without waiting for permission, his expression carrying the urgency that indicated immediate crisis. "Davis, we have a problem. The human delegation is preparing for immediate departure. Their ambassador claims to have received urgent communications from the capital requiring their immediate return." Davis felt cold certainty settle in his stomach. Diplomatic emergencies that required urgent departure were rarely genuine crises and frequently pretexts for withdrawal when negotiations weren't proceeding as expected. "Did he specify the nature of this emergency?" Davis asked. "Border tensions in the eastern provinces. Apparently there have been raids that require immediate military response." Matthias glanced at Aveline apologetically. He was quite insistent that Lady Aveline's presence might be required to help coordinate defensive measures with human forces. The suggestion was political poison, wrapped in reasonable language. If Aveline departed with the human delegation, it would signal to every vampire house that the marriage alliance was already failing, that the human bride could be recalled whenever her kingdom found the arrangement inconvenient. But refusing to allow her to assist with defensive measures would suggest vampire unwillingness to honor the collaborative spirit their marriage was supposed to represent. "How convenient," Aveline murmured, her voice carrying dry amusement rather than concern. "Eastern border raids that require my specific expertise in defensive coordination, skills I didn't realize I possessed until this moment." Davis looked at her sharply. "You think this is a pretext?" "I think someone wants to test whether our marriage can survive its first political crisis." Aveline stood and moved to the window, her posture suggesting careful thought rather than emotional distress. "The question is whether we're being tested by your enemies, mine or someone else, entirely." The casual reference to her having enemies sent another chill through Davis's awareness. New brides from minor noble houses didn't typically acquire the sort of enemies that would orchestrate elaborate political maneuvers. "What do you recommend?" he asked, curious to hear her strategic assessment. Aveline turned from the window with a smile that held edges sharp enough to cut. "I recommend we give them exactly what they're not expecting. I'll meet with the ambassador and explain that while I appreciate their concern for my expertise, my place is here, supporting my husband in maintaining the peace our marriage was designed to protect. That's likely to create considerable political tension with your former guardians." "Yes," Aveline agreed with satisfaction that suggested she was looking forward to the confrontation. "It is." As Davis watched her prepare to face down pressure from the human court with apparent relish, he realized that whatever game was being played around their marriage, his bride was not the helpless pawn either side had positioned her to be. She was a player with her own agenda, and he was beginning to suspect that agenda might be far more complex than simple political survival. The question was whether discovering what she really wanted would prove to be salvation or catastrophe. Davis's investigation into Aveline's background yielded fragments of information that created more questions than answers. His network of informants, vampire spies who had spent decades cultivating sources throughout the human kingdoms, returned reports that should have been routine, but instead painted a picture of deliberate obscuration. Lady Aveline of House Blackthorn had indeed been raised in the royal court after her parents' deaths, but the plague that had supposedly claimed them had left no other documented casualties. The estate where she had allegedly grown up had been abandoned for over a century before her supposed birth. Most tellingly, none of his sources could find anyone who claimed to have known her personally before her arrival at court 5 years ago. It's as if she appeared fully formed, Matthias reported during one of their evening conferences. Educated, accomplished, politically astute, but without any of the personal connections or shared memories that should exist for someone raised in court circles. Davis stood in the castle's rose garden, where centuries-old plants had long since ceased to bloom, despite careful tending. The blood rose garden had been planted by one of his predecessors, a vampire lord whose beloved had died during the early years of human-vampire conflict. Legend claimed the roses would bloom again only in the presence of true love between vampire and mortal, but Davis had long dismissed such romantic nonsense as convenient mythology. Yet over the past weeks, he had noticed subtle changes in the garden, new growth on previously barren stems, buds that seemed to be forming despite the approach of winter. He told himself it was coincidence, improved soil conditions, or simple seasonal variation, but the timing of the changes, beginning shortly after Avelin's arrival, was difficult to ignore. "She's preparing for something," Davis said, watching Avalon through the garden's arched windows as she moved through the castle's great hall. She had requested a formal dinner with the visiting vampire lords who had remained after the wedding, ostensibly to strengthen social connections with her new neighbors. But Davis suspected her motivations went beyond simple diplomacy. The dinner proved to be an education in political sophistication that left Davis reconsidering everything he thought he knew about his bride's capabilities. Avalyn navigated conversations with vampire lords who had spent centuries perfecting their ability to detect weakness and exploit advantage. She fielded questions about human political intentions with answers that satisfied their concerns without revealing anything that might compromise human interests. Most impressively, she demonstrated knowledge of vampire history and customs that should have required decades of study to acquire. Lord Aldrich, ancient even by vampire standards and notoriously difficult to impress, spent an hour testing Avalyn's understanding of territorial law and bloodline politics. By the end of their conversation, he was nodding with something approaching respect. "Your bride has a remarkable grasp of our ways," he told Davis quietly as the evening wound down. "Most humans require years to understand the subtleties of vampire social hierarchy. She speaks as if she's been navigating our politics for decades." The observation echoed Davis's own concerns. Avalyn moved through vampire society with the confidence of an insider rather than the careful uncertainty of someone learning unfamiliar customs. When Lord Henrik tested her knowledge of ancient feeding rituals, she responded with accuracy that suggested first-hand familiarity rather than scholarly research. It was during the dessert course that the evening took an unexpected turn. A young vampire-serving girl, nervous about working such an important event, stumbled while carrying a tray of crystal goblets. The precious glassware, centuries old and irreplaceable, fell toward the stone floor in what should have been an inevitable disaster. Avalyn's hand moved with inhuman speed, catching the falling tray before it could shatter. The motion was fluid, precise, and far faster than any human should have been capable of. More tellingly, she didn't seem to realize her mistake until she noticed the absolute silence that had fallen over the dining hall. Every vampire at the table stared at her with expressions ranging from surprise to calculation. The display of supernatural reflexes was impossible to dismiss as lucky timing or exceptional human ability. It had been a demonstration of capabilities that belonged to immortal beings rather than mortal ones. "Remarkable reflexes," Lord Aldrich observed, his tone carefully neutral. "Quite extraordinary for someone of human birth." Avalyn set the tray down with hands that remained perfectly steady, despite the scrutiny of a dozen ancient vampires. "I've always been somewhat quick to react in crisis situations. Perhaps it comes from growing up in a court where political disasters could strike without warning. The explanation was plausible enough to provide conversational cover, but Davis could see that none of the assembled lords were convinced. They were all too experienced in the nuances of supernatural ability to mistake what they had witnessed for enhanced human reflexes. After the guests departed, Davis found Ovelyn in the castle's library, studying a text written in a language that predated most human scholarship. She looked up as he entered, her expression carrying the slight wariness of someone who knew uncomfortable questions were coming. "An eventful evening," Davis observed, settling into a chair near her reading table. "Your performance impressed our guests considerably. I hope I didn't embarrass you with any social missteps. Vampire etiquette is more complex than human court protocols." "On the contrary, you navigated vampire politics with skill that would be remarkable in someone with decades of experience, which raises interesting questions about how you acquired such expertise." Aveline closed the ancient book and regarded him with the direct gaze that had become familiar over their weeks together. "What sort of questions?" "The sort that concern a husband who discovers his wife possesses abilities she hasn't mentioned. Enhanced reflexes, healing powers, knowledge of magical texts written in languages that haven't been spoken for centuries." Davis kept his tone conversational, but allowed steel to creep into his voice. "The sort of questions that make me wonder what both kingdoms conspired to place in my household." "Perhaps," Aveline said quietly, "the better question is what you're prepared to discover about the woman you married." The challenge was delivered without heat, but it carried implications that made Davis pause. In his experience, people who offered to reveal dangerous truths usually possessed secrets that would change everything about existing arrangements. "I'm prepared to discover whatever truth will help me protect my people and maintain the peace we've worked to establish," Davis replied carefully. Aveline's smile held shadows of sadness mixed with what might have been relief. "Even if that truth challenges everything you thought you knew about this marriage and its purpose?" Before Davis could respond, a commotion in the courtyard below drew their attention. Torches moved in organized patterns that suggested the arrival of unexpected visitors, riders approaching the castle gates despite the late hour. Matthias appeared in the library doorway, his expression grim. "Davis, we have visitors. A delegation from the Eastern Lords, traveling under banner of urgent counsel. They're requesting immediate audience." The Eastern Lords rarely traveled together, except when facing threats that required unified response. Their arrival at this hour suggested either extraordinary opportunity or significant danger, and Davis had learned to prepare for the worst when ancient vampires abandoned normal diplomatic protocols. "What do they want?" Davis asked. "They claim to have information about magical threats to the stability of our territories, information that relates directly to—" Matthias glanced at Aveline apologetically. "To recent changes in the local supernatural balance." Davis felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to align in ways he didn't like. The timing was too convenient, the subject matter too specific to recent events in his household. Someone had been watching, gathering information, and preparing to act on what they had learned. "Show them to the formal receiving chamber," Davis decided. "And Matthias, have security doubled around the castle. If they're here about supernatural threats, I want to know what manner of danger they think they've identified." As Matthias departed to make arrangements, Aveline rose from her chair with fluid grace. "I should retire and allow you to handle this political business without distraction." "Actually," Davis said, studying her reaction carefully, "I think it would be wise for you to join us. If they truly have concerns about supernatural threats related to recent changes in our territory, your perspective might prove valuable." Something flickered across Aveline's expression. Surprise, calculation, and perhaps the faintest trace of fear. For the first time since their marriage, she looked genuinely uncertain about the course of events. "As you wish," she agreed quietly. "Though I suspect their concerns may prove more complicated than simple territorial politics." Davis had the uncomfortable feeling that whatever complications lay ahead, they were about to discover that their marriage had been the opening move in a much larger and more dangerous game than either of them had realized. The Eastern Lords brought news that transformed the castle's atmosphere from cautious optimism to barely controlled tension. Lord Casimir, eldest of their delegation, spoke with the measured precision of someone delivering information he wished he didn't possess. "Border skirmishes have escalated beyond simple territorial disputes," he reported, his ancient features grave in the candlelight of the formal receiving chamber. "Human settlements are reporting supernatural attacks that exceed anything that vampires are capable of. Entire villages drained of life force, protective wards shattered by magical assaults that leave no survivors to describe what they faced." Davis felt cold certainty settling in his chest. "You believe something other than vampires is responsible?" "We know something else is responsible. Our own scouts have investigated the attack sites. The magical signatures left behind are—" Casimir paused, his gaze flickering to Aveline before returning to Davis. "They're consistent with ancient sorcery, the kind that predates both vampire and human civilizations." The implications hung heavy in the air. Ancient sorcery meant practitioners with power that dwarfed anything their current treaty arrangements were designed to handle. Worse, if such attacks were being blamed on vampires, the fragile peace they had worked to establish could shatter completely. "What do you require from us?" Davis asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Cooperation in hunting down the source of these attacks. And—" Lord Casimir's expression grew more troubled. "Information about any unusual magical activities or presences that might have appeared in your territory recently." The words were carefully chosen, but their meaning was clear. The Eastern Lords suspected that whatever was causing the attacks had some connection to recent events at Ravenmoor, which meant they suspected Aveline. Davis glanced at his wife, noting the complete stillness that had overtaken her posture. She sat with perfect composure, but there was something in her eyes that reminded him of a predator calculating distances to potential threats. "I'm not aware of any unusual magical activities in our territory," Davis replied carefully. "Our borders have remained peaceful since the marriage alliance was established." "Of course," Lord Casimir agreed with diplomatic politeness, "though we would appreciate the opportunity to examine any artifacts or magical objects that might have been brought into your territory as part of recent diplomatic exchanges. Sometimes the most innocent items can create unexpected resonances with ancient powers." The request was reasonable on its surface, but clearly aimed at investigating Aveline's possessions. Davis found himself facing a choice between protecting his wife's privacy and maintaining the trust of vampire lords whose support might be essential if genuine threats were emerging. Aveline spoke before he could respond. "I would be happy to assist with any investigation that might help resolve these attacks," she said calmly. "Though I should mention that some of my personal effects are family heirlooms with protective enchantments. Disturbing them carelessly might create more problems than it solves." The admission sent a ripple of tension through the assembled lords. Protective enchantments suggested magical knowledge and ability far beyond what any minor human noble should possess. More importantly, it was the first direct acknowledgement from Orvelin that her possessions included genuinely magical items. What manner of protective enchantments? Lord Henrik inquired with the polite interest that barely concealed deeper suspicion. The sort that have kept my family line safe from supernatural threats for generations. Nothing harmful to our hosts, but potentially dangerous to anyone who might attempt to use such items without proper preparation. Aveline's smile remained pleasant, while her words carried clear warning. I'm sure you understand the importance of respecting another family's magical traditions. It was a masterful response that acknowledged their concerns while establishing boundaries around her possessions. But Davis noticed it also confirmed what the visiting lords had suspected, that Aveline's presence at Ravenmoor involved magical elements that went far beyond simple political marriage. The meeting continued for another hour, with increasingly detailed discussions of the attacks and their implications for regional stability. Maps were consulted, witness reports examined, and strategic responses debated. Throughout it all, Davis found himself watching Aveline for signs of how these revelations affected her. She participated in the discussions with the same intelligent engagement she had shown in previous political meetings, but there was a new tension in her posture that suggested the attacks were more than academic concerns to her. When Lord Casimir described the magical signatures found at attack sites, her hands tightened almost imperceptibly in her lap. When the conversation turned to potential countermeasures against ancient sorcery, she offered observations that demonstrated uncomfortably specific knowledge of such magical practices. After the Eastern Lords departed for the guest quarters they would occupy during their investigation, Davis found himself alone with Aveline for the first time since the evening began. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and barely acknowledged fears. "You know what's causing the attacks," Davis said quietly. It wasn't a question. Aveline moved to the window, her reflection ghost-like in the dark glass. "I know what might be causing them, and if I'm right, our marriage may have been the catalyst that brought this threat into the open." The admission sent ice through Davis's veins. "Explain." "There are forces that have opposed any lasting peace between vampires and humans for centuries, not because they favor one side over the other, but because conflict between our peoples serves their purposes." Aveline turned from the window, her expression grave. "They thrive on the magical energy generated by warfare and death. Peace threatens their power source." "And you think our marriage alliance has provoked them into action?" "I think our marriage represents something they cannot allow to succeed. A genuine partnership between vampire and human leaders could inspire others to seek similar alliances. Eventually, the regional conflicts they depend upon might disappear entirely." Davis absorbed this information, his mind racing through the implications. "You're saying we've made ourselves targets of forces that profit from perpetual warfare." "I'm saying we may have made ourselves targets of my family's ancient enemies." Aveline's voice carried a weight of personal history that confirmed his growing suspicions about her true background. "The attacks on those villages, their messages meant for me. Demonstrations of power intended to force me into revealing myself." "And what happens when you do?" Aveline's smile held depths of sadness that spoke of centuries rather than decades of accumulated pain. "Then you discover whether the woman you married is worth the war that's coming." Before Davis could respond to that ominous prediction, a new commotion erupted in the courtyard below. This time, the approaching riders carried torches that burned with unnatural colors, blues and purples that had nothing to do with normal flame. The horses beneath them moved with supernatural speed, covering ground faster than any mortal mount could manage. Matthias burst into the chamber without ceremony, his face pale with urgency. "Davis, we're under attack. The outer wards are holding, But something is testing our defenses with magic that's not like anything we've seen before. Through the window, Davis could see lights moving in patterns around the castle's perimeter, not the organized formations of military assault, but something more ritual in nature. The very air seemed to thrum with hostile energy that made his vampire senses recoil. "They've found me," Aveline said quietly, her voice carrying resignation, mixed with determination. "The question now is whether we face them together, or whether you decide the risks of protecting me outweigh any benefits our alliance might provide." Davis looked at his wife, ancient, powerful, and apparently hunted by enemies who commanded forces capable of threatening entire kingdoms. The logical choice would be to distance himself from whatever conflict she had brought to his doorstep. The safe choice would be to protect his people by removing the source of danger from their territory. Instead, he found himself thinking about silver hair catching candlelight, intelligent conversation that had filled empty evenings with unexpected pleasure, and the way she had healed young Marcus without hesitation or expectation of reward. "We face them together," Davis said, his decision surprising him with its certainty. "But first, I need to know exactly what we're facing and what weapons we have available to use against it." Aveline's expression shifted from resigned determination to something that might have been hope mixed with fierce satisfaction. "In that case, my lord husband, it's time you learned the truth about the Shadowbane sword." As she spoke, Davis realized that whatever game had been played around their marriage, they had just moved into its most dangerous phase. The only question now was whether they would emerge from it as allies or casualties. The Shadowbane sword lay in a hidden chamber beneath the castle's oldest foundations, a weapon that Davis had inherited but never dared to wield. Forged in the earliest days of vampire civilization, it was said to be the only blade capable of permanently destroying immortal beings, both vampire and any other supernatural entities that had learned to cheat death. Davis had kept its existence secret, even from his closest advisors, understanding that knowledge of such a weapon would make him either a target or a tyrant. But as he led Aveline through the winding stone passages that descended deep beneath Ravenmoor's foundations, he realized that secrets had become luxuries neither of them could afford. The attacks on the castle's outer wards were intensifying, and whatever forces sought to claim his wife possessed power that conventional weapons would be useless against. "The sword has been in your family for generations," Aveline observed, as they descended the final flight of steps toward the hidden chamber. Her voice echoed strangely in the narrow passage, carrying undertones that suggested she was not entirely surprised by their destination. "But you've never drawn it." "The last vampire lord who wielded the Shadowbane sword used it to end a civil war by eliminating every rival who opposed him. When the killing was finished, he discovered that the blade had absorbed not just his enemies' lives, but portions of their hatred, their rage, their thirst for vengeance." Davis paused at the heavy oak door that sealed the chamber, his hand resting on iron locks that had remained unopened for over a century. It drove him mad within a decade. He ended his own existence with the same blade that had given him absolute power. And yet you're willing to risk that fate now. Aveline moved closer, her presence somehow making the cold stone passages feel less oppressive. "What's changed?" Davis considered the question as he worked the ancient locks, their mechanisms protesting decades of disuse with harsh, grinding sounds. What had changed was everything: his understanding of their marriage, his perception of the threats they faced, and most dangerously, his recognition that the prospect of losing her felt worse than the fear of what wielding such a weapon might cost him. I've discovered that some things are worth risking madness to protect, he admitted quietly. The chamber beyond the door was circular, carved from living rock, and lit by crystals that had absorbed magical energy for centuries. At its center stood a simple stone pedestal, and resting upon it lay a blade that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The Shadowbane sword appeared unremarkable at first glance. Plain crossguard, leather-wrapped grip, a blade of what might have been ordinary steel, but approaching it made Davis's vampire senses recoil from emanations of power that felt older and more dangerous than anything he had previously encountered. Aveline stopped just inside the chamber's threshold, her face pale but determined. Before you touch that blade, there are things you need to know about why I'm here and what our marriage was truly meant to accomplish. Davis turned from the weapon to face his wife, noting the way she held herself, straight-backed and formal, as if preparing for a confession that would change everything between them. "I am not Lady Aveline of House Blackthorn," she began, her voice carrying the weight of truth that could no longer be contained. "That identity was created 5 years ago to provide cover for my real purpose. I am Aveline Ravencrest, daughter of the line of sorceresses, who have served as guardians of the balance between mortal and immortal realms for over 1,000 years." The revelation hit Davis like a physical blow. Ravencrest was a name from legend, associated with magical practitioners who had shaped the earliest treaties between supernatural species and human kingdoms. If the stories were true, the Ravencrest line possessed power that rivaled the oldest vampires and a mandate that transcended any mortal government's authority. "You're over 1,000 years old," Davis said, his voice carefully controlled. "You've been alive longer than I have." "I've been alive longer than anyone currently walking this earth," Aveline confirmed. "I watched the rise and fall of the empire that built these mountains' first settlements. I helped negotiate the original accords that established vampire territories. And for the past 5 centuries, I've been hunting the entity that is currently testing your castle's defenses." Davis felt the world reorganizing itself around this new information. The marriage alliance was orchestrated by cosmic forces that recognized a threat to the balance we've all worked to maintain. Your people need peace to survive and prosper. Humans need protection from supernatural predators who see them as nothing more than resources to be consumed. But there are ancient powers that profit from endless conflict between our species, and one of them has grown strong enough to threaten everything we've built. Aveline moved closer to the pedestal, though she was careful not to touch the weapon itself. The entity, calling itself the Shadow Court, has been manipulating conflicts between vampires and humans for centuries, feeding on the magical energy generated by warfare and death. Every border skirmish, every failed negotiation, every outbreak of violence between our peoples has made it stronger. And our marriage was meant to be the catalyst for a new kind of partnership, one powerful enough to inspire others and eventually eliminate the regional conflicts the Shadow Court depends upon. Aveline's expression grew troubled. But it was also meant to be my final mission. The cosmic forces that bound me to this task included provisions for my own destruction if I succeeded in establishing lasting peace. Davis stared at her, processing implications that made his centuries of political maneuvering seem like children's games. "You're saying that saving both our peoples requires your death?" I was saying that, until something happened that changed the fundamental nature of the binding. Aveline looked directly at him, her ancient eyes holding emotions that spoke of genuine surprise at the direction her existence had taken. "I fell in love with my husband." The words hung between them in the crystal-lit chamber, carrying weight that had nothing to do with magical power and everything to do with personal truth. Davis realized that what he had interpreted as political skill and diplomatic intelligence had actually been the careful attention of someone who genuinely cared about his well-being and the success of their partnership. The cosmic binding included provisions for success through either destruction or redemption, Aveline continued. My love for you, and yours for me, if I'm not mistaken, has changed the magical framework itself. Instead of ending the Shadow Court's threat through my sacrifice, we can end it through the power of genuine unity between our peoples. Davis moved closer to her, drawn by the need to understand not just the political implications, but the personal ones. When you say you love me, I mean that 800 years of loneliness have taught me to recognize genuine partnership when I find it. I mean that discovering someone who understands the weight of immortal responsibility has been worth all the deception required to reach this point. Aveline reached toward him, her hand stopping just short of touching his face. I mean that the thought of losing you to the Shadow Court's retaliation terrifies me more than the prospect of my own destruction. Before Davis could respond, the chamber shook as something struck the castle's outer defenses with enough force to crack ancient stone. The crystal lights flickered, and both vampires turned toward the Shadowbane sword as its blade began to emit a low humming sound that spoke of awakening power. It knows we're here, Aveline said urgently. The Shadow Court's avatar has reached the castle's inner defenses. We're out of time for gradual revelation and careful planning. Davis reached for the sword's grip, then hesitated as the full implications of Aveline's confession crystallized in his mind. If you're right about the cosmic binding being changed by our love, what happens if we succeed in destroying this threat? Aveline's smile carried centuries of hope that had finally found justification. Then we get to discover what eternity looks like when shared with someone who understands both its burdens and its possibilities. The chamber shook again, more violently this time, and Davis could hear sounds of battle echoing through the castle's corridors above them. Whatever was attacking Ravenmoor had breached their outer defenses and was advancing toward the heart of the fortress. There was no more time for hesitation or careful consideration of consequences. Davis grasped the Shadowbane sword's grip, feeling ancient power surge through the blade and into his awareness. The weapon's hunger was immediate and overwhelming, a desire to cut, to destroy, to end existence itself. But beneath that terrible purpose, he sensed something else. Recognition. The blade knew why it had been awakened and what enemy it was meant to face. Together? He asked, offering Aveline his free hand. Together, she agreed, her fingers intertwining with his as magical energy began to build around them both. As they prepared to ascend toward battle, Davis realized that whatever emerged from the coming confrontation, neither of them would be the same people who had descended into this chamber. They would either forge a new future from the crucible of conflict, or they would face destruction as partners rather than as the isolated individuals they had been for so many centuries. In the magical light radiating from their joined hands and the awakened blade, the chamber around them seemed to pulse with potential for either salvation or catastrophe. The ascent from the hidden chamber to the castle's great hall felt like rising through layers of increasingly hostile magical energy. With each flight of stone steps, the Shadowbane sword's weight seemed to grow heavier in Davis's grip, not from physical mass, but from the accumulating awareness of what wielding such a weapon would demand of him. The blade's hunger pressed against his consciousness, whispering promises of absolute victory through absolute destruction. Beside him, Aveline moved with the fluid grace of someone finally free to express her true nature. Gone was the careful reserve of a diplomatic bride. In its place was the confident bearing of a sorceress who had spent centuries mastering powers that most beings could barely comprehend. Her moonstone pendant blazed with silver light that pushed back the unnatural shadows creeping through the castle's corridors, and Davis could feel magical energy building around her like the calm before a devastating storm. They reached the great hall to find chaos. Matthias stood behind an overturned table, shouting orders to vampire guards who were struggling to maintain defensive positions against attacks that came from no visible source. Windows shattered inward as creatures of living shadow poured through the openings, their forms shifting between solid matter and dark mist as they advanced on the castle's defenders. The Eastern Lords had taken positions near the massive fireplace, their combined centuries of combat experience allowing them to coordinate attacks against enemies that conventional weapons could barely touch. But Davis could see exhaustion in their movements, the telltale signs of warriors facing foes that exceeded their capacity to resist. "Lord Davis!" Matthias called, relief evident in his voice as he spotted them. "The outer wards have fallen completely. Whatever's commanding these creatures is more powerful than our defenses were designed to handle." Davis surveyed the battlefield that his home had become, noting the way the shadow creatures avoided direct confrontation in favor of harassing attacks that wore down his people's resistance. This wasn't an assault meant to capture territory or eliminate specific targets. It was a demonstration of power designed to force someone into the open. "They're not here to destroy the castle," he realized aloud. "They're here to force Evelyn to reveal herself fully." As if summoned by his words, a new presence made itself known. The temperature in the great hall plummeted as something far more substantial than shadow creatures began to materialize near the hall's center. The entity that took shape was tall, elegant, and beautiful in the way that predators are beautiful, perfectly designed to inspire both desire and terror. "Aveline Ravencrest," the entity spoke, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in the bones of everyone present. "You have hidden behind mortal politics and romantic sentiment long enough. The balance you were sworn to protect has already shifted beyond repair. Join with us willingly, and your husband's people may survive what comes next." Davis felt Aveline's hand tighten in his as she stepped forward to face the entity directly. Her voice, when she spoke, carried authority that made the ancient stones of Ravenmoor seem to listen. "Malphus, still trading in threats and false promises, I see. Though I notice you've finally grown powerful enough to manifest physically, rather than hiding behind intermediaries. The Shadow Court has fed well on the conflicts your presence was meant to prevent." The entity, Malphus, replied with satisfaction that felt like ice against exposed skin. "Every border skirmish, every failed negotiation between vampire and human territories has strengthened us beyond your capacity to oppose. The time for balance has ended. Join us, or watch everything you sought to protect burn." Davis had spent centuries learning to read supernatural politics, but the conversation between Aveline and Malphus operated on levels that transcended anything in his experience. These were beings who had shaped the fundamental nature of reality itself, and their conflict involved forces that could reshape the relationship between mortal and immortal worlds. "You're afraid," Aveline observed, her tone carrying the analytical detachment of someone solving a complex puzzle. "The Shadow Court has grown strong, yes, but not strong enough to simply take what you want through direct action. You still need my willing cooperation to break the cosmic bindings that maintain the barrier between realms." Malphus's beautiful features shifted into an expression of cold anger. Your sentimental attachment to this vampire lord changes nothing. The binding that brought you here included provisions for failure as well as success. If you cannot establish lasting peace through alliance, you will establish it through elimination of one side entirely. The words sent ice through Davis's awareness. He had understood that their marriage was politically significant, but the implications Malphus was revealing suggested consequences that extended far beyond regional stability. "What elimination?" Davis demanded, though part of him already suspected the answer. Aveline's expression grew grim. "The cosmic forces that bound me to this mission included a fail-safe provision. If lasting peace cannot be established through cooperation, it can be achieved through ensuring that only one supernatural species survives to threaten the other. You're saying the binding would force you to choose between destroying all vampires or all humans?" Davis felt the Shadowbane sword's weight shift in his grip, as if the weapon were responding to the growing tension. "I'm saying that's what Malphus wants me to believe. But the binding changed when we fell in love, remember? The cosmic forces that created this situation didn't account for genuine partnership between the species they were trying to balance." Aveline turned back to Malphus, her voice growing stronger. "Which is why you're here trying to force me into the old pattern instead of simply claiming victory." Malphus gestured, and the shadow creatures throughout the hall began to coalesce into more solid, more threatening forms. "Sentiment will not alter cosmic law, sorceress. The binding remains in effect, and the deadline for its fulfillment approaches rapidly. Choose destruction of one species, or watch both be consumed by chaos that will feed the Shadow Court for millennia." Davis realized they had reached the point where careful strategy and diplomatic maneuvering would no longer suffice. Whatever power Malphus commanded, it was being held in check only by Aveline's continued resistance to the cosmic binding's apparent requirements. But that resistance was costing her, and he could see the strain beginning to show in her posture and expression. "There's a third option," Davis said, stepping forward to stand beside his wife. "We destroy the Shadow Court entirely, eliminating the source of the conflicts that maintain the imbalance you profit from." Malphus's laugh was like breaking glass mixed with distant screaming. "With what power, Vampire Lord? Your blade can destroy immortal beings. Yes, but the Shadow Court exists across multiple realms simultaneously. You would need to eliminate every avatar, every manifestation, every fragment of our essence before any single death would prove permanent. And you would need to do it all at once, before we could regenerate or retreat to dimensions your weapons cannot reach." "Alone, perhaps that would be impossible," Aveline agreed, her voice growing thoughtful. "But not if two sources of power combined their efforts at exactly the right moment." Davis felt her hand squeeze his, and suddenly he understood what she was proposing. The Shadowbane sword could destroy immortal beings permanently, but its power was limited to single targets in the immediate vicinity. Aveline's sorcery could reach across dimensional boundaries, but lacked the focused destruction necessary to eliminate entities of the Shadow Court's magnitude. Together, however, their combined power might be able to accomplish what neither could achieve alone. "The crown of shadows," Davis said, understanding flooding through him. "The ceremonial crown that's been in my family for generations. It's not just decorative, is it?" Aveline's smile held grim satisfaction. "It's a focusing device, designed to amplify and direct magical energy through the wearer. But it was also designed with a safeguard. It will kill anyone whose heart remains frozen by centuries of isolation and emotional withdrawal. And if the wearer's heart has learned to love again, then it becomes the most powerful magical focus ever created, capable of channeling combined energies across any distance or dimensional barrier." Davis felt pieces of a plan beginning to align in his mind, dangerous and requiring perfect timing, but possibly their only chance of ending the Shadow Court's threat permanently. But it would require him to risk not just his existence, but his sanity, wearing a crown that would either amplify their combined power beyond imagination or destroy him if any part of his old emotional isolation remained. The ritual would have to be performed at the moment when dimensional barriers are thinnest, Aveline continued, her voice growing urgent, and Malthus would have to be present in full manifestation, anchoring the Shadow Court's power in this realm long enough for our attack to reach all their dimensional strongholds simultaneously. Malthus had been listening to their exchange with growing alarm, clearly recognizing the potential threat their plan represented. "You would destroy yourselves attempting such a working," the entity snarled. "The power required would burn out both your essences entirely." "Perhaps," Aveline acknowledged, "but it would also eliminate the Shadow Court permanently, ensuring that the peace we've begun to build could continue without supernatural manipulation." Davis looked around the great hall, taking in the faces of vampires who had served his family for centuries, thinking of human settlements that depended on the stability their alliance provided, considering the future that Aveline's sacrifice, and his own, might make possible. "When do we begin?" he asked quietly. Aveline's expression shifted from grim determination to something that might have been wonder. "You're willing to risk everything for a chance at saving both our peoples? I'm willing to risk everything for the woman I love, and the future she's shown me we might build together." Davis raised the Shadowbane sword, feeling its power respond to his emotional certainty. "Besides, 800 years of existence have taught me that some choices are worth making regardless of their personal cost." Malthus began to manifest more fully, clearly preparing to prevent their attempt through direct intervention. Around the hall, shadow creatures moved into attack positions, ready to overwhelm the castle's defenders before any ritual could be completed. "Now or never," Aveline said, magical energy beginning to build around her hands, like contained lightning. Davis placed the crown of shadows on his head, feeling ancient metal settle against his brow, with weight that seemed to press directly against his soul. Either his heart had truly learned to love again, or he was about to discover that 8 centuries of emotional isolation could not be overcome by a few weeks of unexpected partnership. The crown flared to life with silver fire, and Davis realized there was no longer any question about the outcome. They would succeed in their desperate gambit, or they would die together in the attempt. The crown of shadows blazed with silver fire that seemed to burn away everything in Davis's awareness, except the essential truth of what he had become through loving Aveline. 8 centuries of carefully constructed emotional barriers crumbled as the ancient artifact tested his heart and found it transformed beyond recognition. Instead of the killing cold that should have stopped his immortal existence, warmth flooded through him, the crown accepting him as worthy to channel power beyond anything he had previously imagined. Aveline stepped closer, her hands beginning to weave patterns in the air that left traces of golden light hanging like suspended starfire. The magical working she was constructing grew more complex with each gesture, creating a framework that would allow their combined energies to reach across dimensional boundaries simultaneously. But Davis could see the effort it required, the way her face grew pale as she drew upon reserves of power that even her ancient strength might not be able to sustain. Malthus moved with inhuman speed, shadow-wreathed claws extending toward Aveline's throat in a strike meant to end their desperate gambit before it could begin. But the Shadowbane sword was already in motion, its blade intercepting the attack with a sound like reality itself, screaming in protest. Where the weapon met shadow flesh, Malphas's avatar began to dissolve, not destroyed, but forced back toward whatever dimensional realm normally contained the Shadow Court's true essence. "You delay the inevitable," Malphas snarled, reforming several feet away with visible effort. "Even if you succeed in damaging our avatars in this realm, the Shadow Court exists beyond your capacity to reach. We will regenerate, rebuild, and return with power that makes this manifestation seem trivial." "Perhaps," Davis agreed, feeling the crown's power building toward something that made his vampire senses recoil in anticipation. "But you've made one crucial error in your calculations." Around the Great Hall, the shadow creatures Malphas commanded began to converge on their position, moving with coordinated precision that spoke of direct control rather than independent action. Davis realized this was exactly what they needed. Malphas was consolidating the Shadow Court's presence in this dimension, making himself the anchor point that connected all their scattered manifestations across multiple realms. Aveline's magical working reached a critical threshold, and suddenly Davis could perceive the true scope of what they were attempting. Through the crown's amplification of his awareness, he could see the Shadow Court's multidimensional structure, tentacles of dark influence extending across dozens of reality layers, feeding on conflicts and chaos throughout the supernatural world. But all of those extensions connected to the manifestation standing before them, making Malphas both the Shadow Court's greatest strength and their ultimate vulnerability. "You're not just an avatar," Davis said with growing understanding. "You're the core consciousness that maintains their entire interdimensional presence." Malphas's beautiful features twisted with something that might have been fear. "Even if that were true, destroying me would require power that neither of you possess individually." "But we're not individuals anymore," Aveline said, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated with the magical framework she had created. "Love doesn't just change hearts, it changes the fundamental nature of magical capacity." She extended her hand toward Davis, and when their fingers touched, the crown's silver fire merged with her golden magic to create something entirely new. Power flowed between them, amplifying and transforming as it moved from one consciousness to the other and back again. Davis felt his vampire strength combining with Aveline's ancient sorcery in ways that transcended simple addition, their unified will creating magical potential that exceeded anything either could have achieved alone. The heart of winter materialized in the air before them, a crystal formation that represented 8 centuries of emotional isolation that Davis had used to protect himself from vulnerability. But as their combined power touched the crystal, it began to crack and shatter, each fragment releasing memories of warmth he had thought lost forever. The breaking of his frozen heart sent shock waves through the magical working, adding personal transformation to cosmic destruction in ways that made the very air around them thrum with potential. "Now," Aveline said urgently, her magical framework reaching the point where it could extend across dimensional boundaries. "The dimensional barriers are at their thinnest. If we're going to strike at the Shadow Court's core, it has to be now." Davis raised the Shadowbane sword, feeling the blade respond to their combined will with eagerness that spoke of purpose finally fulfilled. Through the crown's amplification, he could perceive Malphas's true nature, not just the beautiful, terrible form standing before them, but the vast network of dark influence that stretched across multiple realities. The sword's power, channeled through their love and focused by Aveline's sorcery, could reach all of those distant manifestations simultaneously. But as Davis prepared to strike, Malphas made a final, desperate gambit. The entity began to withdraw its consciousness from the avatar body, preparing to abandon this manifestation in order to preserve the Shadow Court's broader network. If Malphas succeeded in disconnecting from this realm before their attack landed, the entire working would fail. "He's retreating," Davis warned, adjusting his grip on the sword. "If he escapes back to the core dimension—" "Then we follow him there," Aveline said, with determination that brooked no argument. "Our love has changed the cosmic binding. Remember? We're no longer limited to fighting battles in single dimensions." The magical framework she had created began to shift, transforming from a weapon designed to strike across dimensional barriers into a portal that would allow them to pursue their enemy into whatever realm he sought to escape to. But Davis could see the cost such a working would require. Aveline would have to pour her entire essence into maintaining the portal, leaving her defenseless if their attack failed. "Together," Davis said, understanding what she was asking of both of them. "Together," Aveline agreed, and their combined power surged toward a crescendo that would either save both their peoples or destroy everything they had worked to protect. As reality began to warp around them, Davis realized they had moved beyond the point where retreat was possible. Whatever happened next would determine not just their own fate, but the future of supernatural human relations throughout the known world. The dimensional portal Aveline created tore reality apart like fabric, revealing corridors between worlds that no mortal being was meant to perceive. Davis felt the Shadowbane sword pulling him forward into spaces where normal concepts of distance and time held no meaning, following Malphas's retreating essence through realms of shadow and nightmare that existed between the ordered dimensions of normal existence. Their pursuit led them into the Shadow Court's core stronghold, a vast cathedral of crystallized darkness, where the accumulated pain and hatred of centuries had taken architectural form. Pillars twisted from pure malevolence supported vaulted ceilings that wept tears of liquid despair, and the air itself seemed thick with the screams of every conflict the Shadow Court had orchestrated throughout supernatural history. Malphas stood at the cathedral's center, no longer bothering to maintain his beautiful avatar form. In this place of pure darkness, he revealed his true nature, a writhing mass of shadow and hunger that pulsed with the absorbed life force of countless victims. Around him, the accumulated power of the Shadow Court's interdimensional network began to consolidate, preparing for a final confrontation that would determine whether supernatural balance could be restored or whether chaos would consume all ordered existence. "You have followed me into the heart of our power," Malphas said, his voice now echoing from every surface of the Nightmare Cathedral. "Here, where we have fed on conflict for millennia, your combined strength is nothing against the accumulated hatred of centuries." Davis felt the truth of those words, pressing against his consciousness. In this realm, where the Shadow Court's power was concentrated and focused, their love seemed fragile by comparison. But as he looked at Aveline beside him, her silver hair blazing with inner light, her ancient eyes fierce with determination that had sustained her through 1,000 years of lonely guardianship, he realized that love was not meant to overcome hatred through strength alone. "You're right," Davis said, raising the Shadowbane sword so its blade caught reflections from Aveline's magical radiance. "We can't overpower what you've built here, but we don't need to." The sword's true purpose became clear as their combined essence flowed through the blade. The Shadowbane sword was not just a weapon for destroying immortal beings, it was a tool for severing the connections that allowed entities like the Shadow Court to exist across multiple dimensions simultaneously. And those connections, Davis realized, were held together not by strength, but by the fundamental emptiness that came from existence without love, without connection, without the bonds that gave meaning to immortal life. Aveline sorcery wove itself around the sword's power, creating a working that targeted not the Shadow Court's accumulated strength, but the void at its heart, the spiritual emptiness that made entities like Malphas hunger constantly for the emotions they could not generate themselves. Where their love touched that void, the Shadow Court's carefully constructed network began to unravel. "Impossible!" Malphas shrieked, his form beginning to lose cohesion as the interdimensional connections that sustained him started to sever. "Love cannot unmake what hatred has built." "Love doesn't unmake anything," Aveline replied, her voice carrying the wisdom of centuries spent learning the true nature of cosmic balance. "Love simply reveals what was never real in the first place." The phoenix tears began to manifest around them, crystallized drops of pure emotion that appeared whenever impossible barriers were overcome through genuine connection. Each tear that formed added to their working's power, not through magical amplification, but through the fundamental truth they represented: that bonds forged in authentic love possessed a reality that no force in any dimension could ultimately destroy. Davis struck with the Shadowbane sword, not at Malphas's form, but at the network of emptiness that connected the Shadow Court's scattered manifestations. The blade passed through shadow flesh as if it were empty air. But where it touched the void that sustained their interdimensional presence, reality itself seemed to sigh with relief as artificial constructs finally dissolved back into the nothingness from which they had been temporarily assembled. Malphas's scream echoed across dimensions as his consciousness fragmented, no longer able to maintain the unified will that had held the Shadow Court together. Around the Nightmare Cathedral, pillars of crystallized malevolence began to crack and crumble, releasing the absorbed hatred back into the cosmic balance where it could be transformed rather than concentrated. But the working demanded everything they had to give. Davis felt his vampire essence pouring into the sword, while Aveline channeled her 1,000 years of accumulated power through the dimensional framework that allowed their attack to reach every Shadow Court stronghold simultaneously. They were burning themselves out completely, trading their immortal existences for the chance to restore the balance that would protect both their peoples. "Together," Aveline said, her hand finding his as their essences began to merge completely with the working they had created. "Together," Davis agreed, understanding that whatever happened next, they would face it as truly unified beings rather than separate individuals who had learned to cooperate. The Shadowbane sword flared with light that seemed to contain every star that had ever burned, and the Shadow Court's Nightmare Cathedral collapsed into nothing, taking with it the accumulated darkness of centuries, and leaving behind only the possibility of genuine peace between supernatural and human worlds. As reality reasserted itself around them, Davis realized they had succeeded beyond their most optimistic hopes, and that the cost might be exactly what they had expected to pay. Davis awoke to sunlight streaming through windows that should have been shattered, in a castle that should have been destroyed, beside a woman who should not have existed anymore. The great hall of Ravenmoor showed no signs of the battle that had raged there, no broken stone, no scorch marks from magical combat, no evidence that shadow creatures had ever threatened the ancient fortress. Even more remarkably, he felt whole and vital in ways that suggested their desperate gambit had somehow restored, rather than depleted their essential natures. Aveline stirred beside him, her silver hair catching the morning light like spun starshine. When she opened her ancient eyes, they held wonder mixed with the same disbelief, Davis felt at discovering they had somehow survived what should have been a completely self-sacrificing working. "We're still here," she said quietly, her voice carrying amazement at the simple fact of continued existence. Davis sat up carefully, noting that the crown of shadows lay nearby, no longer blazing with silver fire, but somehow transformed into something that looked more like a wedding circlet than an ancient artifact of power. The Shadowbane sword rested against a nearby pillar, its blade now reflecting light normally rather than absorbing it, as if the weapon's terrible purpose had been fulfilled and it could finally rest. "The working succeeded," Davis said, remembering the moment when reality had seemed to collapse around them. "But somehow we weren't consumed by it." Matthias appeared in the hall's doorway, his expression shifting from concern to relief as he saw them both conscious and apparently unharmed. "My lord, Lady Evelyn, thank the ancient powers you're awake. You've been unconscious for 3 days, and we weren't certain." 3 days? Evelyn rose with fluid grace, moving to examine something Davis hadn't noticed, a chalice of unusual design that sat on a nearby table, seeming to glow with gentle inner light. "Has there been any word from the border territories? Any reports of unusual supernatural activity?" "None at all. In fact, the opposite. We've received messages from human settlements reporting that they feel safer than they have in decades. The border tensions that have plagued our region for years seem to have simply disappeared." Matthias paused, studying their faces. "What exactly did you accomplish during the attack?" Davis and Aveline exchanged glances, recognizing that explaining the true scope of what had occurred would be difficult for anyone who hadn't experienced it directly. How could they describe pursuing an interdimensional entity into a realm of crystallized darkness, or the way their love had unraveled centuries of accumulated hatred? "We eliminated the source of the supernatural conflicts that had been undermining peace efforts between our peoples," Aveline said carefully. "The entity that called itself the Shadow Court has been permanently destroyed. What she didn't mention, what Davis suspected they would keep between themselves, was the revelation that had come to them in the moment before consciousness returned. The cosmic forces that had bound Aveline to her mission had not just been satisfied by the Shadow Court's destruction, they had been so impressed by the method of victory that they had granted both Davis and Aveline a new form of immortality, one that was no longer sustained by isolation and predatory necessity, but by the genuine connection they had forged together. The unity chalice that now sat in their hall was evidence of that transformation, a ceremonial vessel that formed when 2 immortal souls achieved true unity, representing not just romantic love, but the kind of partnership that could bridge any divide. Legend held that such chalices appeared perhaps once in a millennium, when circumstances aligned to create connections that transcended individual existence. Over the following weeks, as reports continued to arrive from throughout the region, the extent of their victory became clear. Border disputes that had simmered for decades were being resolved through negotiation rather than violence. Human settlements that had lived in constant fear of supernatural predation were reporting unprecedented cooperation with vampire patrols. Most remarkably, other vampire lords were beginning to negotiate their own alliances with human kingdoms, inspired by the success of the Ravenmoor marriage. "It's spreading," Aveline observed one evening as they reviewed diplomatic correspondence in Davis's study. "The peace we established here is becoming a template for other regions to follow." Davis looked up from a letter requesting his advice on vampire-human marriage customs sent by a lord 3 kingdoms to the south. "Is that what was supposed to happen?" "I don't think anyone knew what was supposed to happen. The cosmic forces that bound me to this mission were responding to a threat that endangered the fundamental balance between supernatural and mortal worlds. But I suspect they were hoping for exactly this outcome. Not just the elimination of the immediate threat, but the establishment of a new model for supernatural human relations. The Bloodrose Garden had become a place of beauty that drew visitors from across the vampire territories. The ancient plants now bloomed constantly, their crimson flowers serving as living proof that love between immortal and mortal beings was not just possible but transformative. Young vampires who had never believed in anything beyond survival came to see the roses and left with new understanding of what their immortal existence might become. Helena had adapted to the changes in castle life with characteristic efficiency, managing an increased flow of diplomatic visitors while maintaining the household routines that kept Ravenmoor functioning as both fortress and home. She had confided to Davis that the castle itself seemed different since the night of the battle, warmer, more welcoming, as if the ancient stones had absorbed some of the love that had saved them all. "What happens now?" Davis asked one evening as they stood together in the rose garden, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Evelyn leaned against him, solid and warm and miraculously still present in his life. "Now we discover what eternity looks like when it's shared with someone who understands both its burdens and its possibilities. We help other couples navigate the challenges of supernatural human partnerships. We raise children who grow up thinking that cooperation between our peoples is normal rather than extraordinary." Children? Davis felt something that might have been hope mixed with wonder. The Unity Chalice grants many gifts to those who drink from it together. Immortality sustained by love rather than predation, magical abilities that strengthen rather than isolate, and yes, the possibility of new life that combines the best qualities of both their natures. Davis considered this revelation, imagining Ravenmoor filled with laughter and learning, with young voices that had never known a world where vampires and humans were natural enemies. It was a future he could never have envisioned during his centuries of cold survival, but one that now seemed not just possible but inevitable. "I love you," he said simply, words that still carried the power to surprise him with their truth. "And I love you," Aveline replied, turning in his arms to face him directly. "For the first time in 1,000 years, I'm excited to see what tomorrow will bring." As they kissed in the garden where impossible roses bloomed as proof of love's transformative power, Davis realized that sometimes the greatest victories were not won through strength or strategy, but through the simple courage to open one's heart to possibilities that seemed too wonderful to be real. The future stretched before them, bright with promise, and warm with the knowledge that they would face whatever challenges came not as isolated individuals, but as partners whose love had literally rewritten the laws that governed their world. In the distance, the first evening stars appeared in the darkening sky, bearing witness to a love that had proved strong enough to change the nature of existence itself.